Good morning, Stephen. Good morning, Kit.
Thank you, everyone. Right, so welcome to day 2 of our hearing 17B, dealing with largely rural matters this week. And Marlene, are you okay to just start us with a prayer today?
I think we'd get struck by lightning if I did it, but I've just got Mitchell next door, so I'm going to go and get him.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Don't we now see today? There you go.
Oh,
Yeah.
Hey Mitchell, sorry to spring this on you.
it's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine, Stephen. Ka pai o e mi ana ki a koutou. Ko ono mai ipurangi nei ki tēnei o ngā ui. Ara ka timata pai ai tō tātona ui ki te karakia. No reira, manawa tīna, manawa tīna, manawa toka, manawa toka. Tēnei o ki tō manawa ka tīna, tēnei o ki tō manawa ka toka, tēnei o ki tō manawa ka pautāi kitia. Tīna no o tō manawa, e manawa ora, e ora. Tūturu o iti o ka maua ki a tīna, tīna, ui e
Tai.
Ka pai. Haere pai atu rātou koutou nei ui.
Yeah.
Tēnā koutou.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you very much, Mitchell. Yes, so just introduce myself in the hearing. Stephen Daish is my name. I'm the hearings panel chairperson for the District Plan Review. I have with me on this hearing Commissioner Kit Littlejohn. So Kit, you introduce yourself.
Tēnā koutou, Kit Littlejohn, assisting Commissioner Daish.
Yes. And just to briefly update those that went on yesterday, we have delegated authority from the council to make recommendations on all of the district plan matters, and there's a hearings panel of 4 of us, and at the moment for this hearing, Kit and I are doing the hearing. So literally that's what we do. We hear evidence, submissions, points of view, and we ask questions along the way just for clarification. So this morning we are starting off, I think, with Rex Hendry. Is Rex online?
Stephen, I'll just try and get hold of him. He doesn't seem to be there online, but yeah, I'm just checking Julie's records to see if we've got the contact details, and yeah, I'll follow it up for you.
That's okay. So we do have our other speakers here, so I'm just checking on who is next up. So I think Daniel, you for Ngā Co-Housing. Are you happy to step up and take us through? We've just received this morning your talking notes, so thank you very much for those. I haven't really had a chance to read those, so if you could just take us through the highlights, and just the floor is yours.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Daniel McEwen toko ingoa o Whanaki Ahau. Kia ora Commissioner Daish and Commissioner Littlejohn. As mentioned, my name is Daniel McEwen, and I am here today as a member of the Ngā Co-Housing community to deliver this oral submission on the group's behalf. I'd just like to disclose that I'm a senior landscape architect with Boone Limited, but are presenting today in a personal capacity and not as an expert witness within my profession. And firstly, I'd like to clarify, actually I might backtrack, which is slightly off my notes, that our written submission is about getting co-housing as a permitted activity within the future urban zone, which was currently declined as part of that written submission. So firstly, I would like to clarify what co-housing is, and then highlight some key points relating to our written submission. And this is just to create awareness around co-housing, as there are some misconceptions and some preconceived ideas that often sort of paint the wrong picture of what the vision and what we're trying to achieve as a group. Co-housing is a diverse, not-for-profit group-led housing development of clustered housing typology centred around common shared facilities, spaces, along with common principles and community and social outcomes and objectives. Co-housing as a model is distinct from both co-living and cooperative housing, and the term originated in Denmark in the late 1960s, which highlights that this as a housing development is not new, but it is relatively new and starting to gain traction in New Zealand. House typologies range from standalone houses, attached terrace house or duplexes in typical suburban co-housing developments, through to apartment or multi-storey unit developments in urban areas where land is scarce and high densities can be achieved. These individual dwellings include traditional amenities with private kitchens, bathrooms, and sometimes laundries, but shared spaces typically feature within a common house and shared facilities within co-housing developments, which include large kitchen, dining areas, and other recreational spaces. Shared outdoor spaces may include perimeter parking, walkways, open space, and gardens. Some key co-housing features are as follows. Not-for-profit, often a not-for-profit group that is design-led housing development with focused around better social, environmental, and financial outcomes than traditional subdivisions. The physical structures of co-housing communities lend themselves to a more efficient use of resources, this including land as a resource, sharing of tools, lawnmowers, and often shared facilities to reduce the impact of individual appliances for each dwelling. Car sharing is another focus to reduce traffic impact within a region, with EVs and alternative modes of transport promoted to help reduce environmental impact, with car parking commonly in co-housing developments kept to the perimeter of the site to promote walking and community interaction, and also reduce the amount of hardstand requirements within when compared to a typical subdivision. Households have independent incomes and private lives, but neighbours collaboratively plan and manage community activities and shared spaces. The legal structure is typically a homeowner association or housing cooperative for individual houses and common facilities, but also has the ability for individual houses to be owned as a fee simple title if desired by the development group. And the existing examples within New Zealand have a combination of these type of legal structures. Community activities feature regularly scheduled shared meals, meetings, and work days. Neighbours gather for parties, games, movies, or other events. And co-housing is a good model to form clubs, organise child and elder care, and carpool. Housing cluster within co-housing, the co-housing model is typical of a 20 to 30 maximum dwellings. And this is backed up by international experience and research to sustain healthy functioning community sizes. To summarise these points, co-housing facilitates interaction among neighbours and thereby provides social, practical, economic and environmental benefits. And in brief, what co-housing is not, which is commonly caught up with some of the misconceptions and perceptions, it is not a commune and is essentially just an alternative form of a housing development which is centred around community-focused living and better environmental outcomes. When relating this back to the district plan and the zone that we're requesting this be considered as a permitted activity, some of the key points to note is that co-housing promotes and assists more affordable housing opportunities, promotes and encourages regenerative and sustainable design practices and principles, provides alternative housing developments to the common developer-led subdivisions that are geared around profit over building community and providing accessible, quality, affordable housing, reduces environmental impact compared to traditional housing developments, and as mentioned in my spiel about what co-housing is, this is done through shared resources, better design principles around sustainable and regenerative design, reducing traffic requirements within the development. It promotes well-being, community interaction and resilience, caters for a wide demographic and seeks to build community through a good cross-section of society where possible, aligns closely or is similar to Māori principles and perspectives on land use, papakainga and community interaction. Co-housing has a clear parameters that can be quantified to assist with the consenting process if it was to become a permitted activity within the future urban zone. I have made these comments to hopefully provide a better understanding of what co-housing is and why it should be considered, in our view, as permitted activity within the future urban zone, to provide alternative forms of housing which can help the region realise its future objectives and contribute towards national climate targets by providing more regenerative and sustainable forms of community housing developments. I'm nearing the end of my spiel, so I'll just continue and then open up for questions after that.
Yes, thanks, Daniel.
Evidence, without repeating references and additional information that is obtained within our written evidence, various links and books cited in there, I'd like to highlight the following points. Nationally and regionally, we are faced with housing shortages and with supply not meeting current demand. Nationally, housing has become a means of financial security and profit generation, primarily, as opposed to serving its primary function of housing security so people have adequate shelter, warmth, which should be an integral part of a district plan to facilitate provision and access to affordable housing and secure rental means of as a secure rental means for home ownership. The role of planning, in my view, should be future focused to not only achieve good outcomes through current legislation, but enable robust process to see future New Plymouth District Council objectives and outcomes achieved and realised. What needs to change? I'd like to end my oral submission with an extract from a publication called Counter Futures, Left Thought and Practice Aotearoa, Issue 9, 2020 Housing. The house is more than an investment. Aotearoa New Zealand housing perceptions need to be reorientated to become primarily focused on providing quality, affordable homes and neighbourhoods for people. The dominant approach to housing in Aotearoa New Zealand conflates financial investment with the provision of housing confusing financial security with housing security. Housing as an asset is not the same thing as housing as a secure place to live, as was evident during the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis. During that period, housing in many places around the world lost significant and sometimes all of its financial value. The majority of those houses remained capable of being homes for the occupants, but the loss of financial value resulted in many evictions. And this closes my oral presentation.
Thank you very much for that, Daniel. I did ask, I was inquiring of the staff reporting officers yesterday about co-housing, and I'd heard the term, but you've really educated me in the matter of 10 minutes very effectively through that incredibly well put together couple of pages. So really thank you for that. I see Naomi and Barbara there. Are you part of the group too? Yeah. Yeah, really appreciate you coming along and helping us learn a bit more about this. We'll see whether Commissioner Littlejohn has any questions. I have a couple of clarifications, but over to you, Kit.
Oh, good morning. Thanks for that. It's a topic very dear to my heart because I had occasion to meet one of the original founders of Nightingale years ago, and had a great time talking with him about bringing the Nightingale concept back to Auckland or New Zealand generally. And then life happened, really. And things got busy. The unitary plan went through and all of that sort of stuff. So, I mean, I'm familiar with the concept of different housing ownership and development models. So that's quite, so you don't need to persuade me on that. I'm just interested, does Ngā Motu Co-housing own any land within any of the proposed future urban zones?
No, and that's, I guess, why we're in this place of submitting is the constraints around securing land, whether it be suburban or urban, for a collective group of trying to develop a project like this ourselves is very difficult. You know, with current legislation from a council perspective, but also from financial lenders and the likes, there's several constraints which make this a lot more difficult than it really should be.
Oh yeah, thanks for the answer. I understand the real problem. Just the way we've constructed ownership of land in our society makes it incredibly difficult for a group of people to advance a project like this. I fear, though, that the way in which the planning regulations essentially address what you can do with the land is probably the least of your problems, if I can put that out there. In terms of the specific submission request, if we were to add co-housing to the list of activities that could be allowed, do you think we would need a definition of co-housing to link that to, or do you think everyone would know what it was as a distinct form of housing that might be different from the common owner-occupier or developer-led sort of development?
Yeah, I believe you probably would need a definition. And as I've said, it's potentially in my notes or my evidence that there are some clear parameters that can be attached to co-housing. And I think the definition would be required just because there's some aspects of a co-housing development that do differ from a normal housing subdivision. And that's more around, you know, as mentioned, around that, how that land ownership is divvied up, that you might not be able to do a traditional fee simple title on each dwelling. And then the way those built elements are distributed through that portion of land. So I think, yeah, without thinking about this question further, I think it's a
Can I
nutshell.
add something to that?
Yeah.
Sure, Barbara, go
Sure.
ahead.
So also one of the differences which Daniel did point out in his notes was it's not a traditional subdivision. Roads don't go through it. So cars are kept to the perimeter to make it people friendly and yeah, kid friendly. So, and the other thing in terms of, do we own land? We've been looking for a very long time, like years now. And the reason we're looking at the future urban zone is because we know there are, pieces of land that would be suitable, like the contour has to be a certain way as well for this kind of development. There are pieces of land that would be suitable, but we can't purchase them if we're not guaranteed that we could do our development there. So that's our constraint at the moment.
You understand the whole purpose of the future urban zone is to essentially earmark for the future, potentially 10 years hence, land that would effectively then become urbanized as part of the city. And the prerequisite for that to happen is by way of this concept called a structure plan, which is almost sort of like a master plan. If you could, there's lots of different ways you could put it, which brings into account all of the opportunities and constraints and all those things for the entire area. Do you think that, how do you see simply making provision? Because at the moment, even if, for example, co-housing were put into the policies and objectives, any proposal to enable residential living at a greater scale than sort of 1 unit per title, even within the future urban zone, would be non-complying in the future urban zone. Did your submission actually seek any greater sort of relief around making the rule journey a little bit easier to get through?
Just in terms of the titles, I know Daniel's talked a bit about it, but the model we would propose to use is unit titles. So it still would be
Subdivision.
Yeah, but not not what people usually think of when they think of subdivision. But yeah, it would be under a body corporate.
Yep, but that would still be, as I understand the legal definitions, it would still be treated as subdivision creating more than one residential unit. So I guess the question is, making the policies, I guess, slightly more accepting of your concept is one thing. Do you think, though, that you need to change the rule structure in any way to assist any specific proposal on a site?
Yeah, my view is with that structure plan, the current rules are, I guess, a bit more of a blunt instrument. So, and I'm not sure how this would be structured to allow activities like co-housing where there's some clear guidance around that. But yeah, because as the future urban zone, it wouldn't be a compliant activity, which doesn't mean it's impossible, but somehow having rules that accommodate that, so you don't have to then go through a resource consent process, that if it fits a set of parameters, then it can be a compliant activity. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying and interpreting it through the journey to get a resource consent. And if your project was non-complying, but you had some policy support because of the specific nature of it, as something slightly different than just multi-unit development, for example, then you would potentially have a consenting pathway.
That sounds great.
Yeah. Oh, look. That's what we're here for. I mean, as out of interest, have you reviewed the evidence that's been put forward for Green School Incorporated?
I have, because I'm involved in a professional level on that body of work.
It's not. I wouldn't want to compare it with the concept of co-housing, but as a community-led initiative for a regenerative village concept, within a precinct. It sort of has similarities to the notion of a co-housing sort of project, but it's just an observation, really. It's not so much a question, but
yeah, and that green school one is essentially, if you boil it down, is a series of co-housing clusters that inform that wider regenerative village approach.
Yep.
And that's, poses that same question of rural sustainable activity. We're sort of stuck in the lens of that activity needs to be on mass scale, but you know, if you look at the traditional village approach, it's more of a micro scale, but the activity is in nature the same.
Yeah, I mean, we very much are at the end of the earth here to some extent, aren't we, in New Zealand? I don't know if you saw recently some of the community housing high rises that are being developed in Barcelona and in Spain, where one of the most recent ones, you buy spaces within the building, and as your needs grow or diminish, you effectively move walls around. So the whole thing is so that you can expand your footprint as a living unit throughout the course of your life, and then shrink it back down again, all within the same building. It got an architectural award, actually. It was quite an interesting design. Anyway, that's again an observation and completely irrelevant, so I don't want to distract you from this.
No,
But,
it's not totally irrelevant, Kit, because if we can't find, we're looking at all options. We are actually looking at urban, central business district. If we could find land there that would work for us and do a medium to high density thing. Yeah. So,
well, I mean, the interesting thing is that even though I know you very much want to distinguish the different concept, I guess from an ownership and principal structure between co-housing and sort of normal housing, let's say like that, as far as the district plan is concerned, it's all the same. It's all residential accommodation. It's just structured slightly differently. So to some extent, possibly your greatest and easiest opportunities exist in those areas of the existing urban footprint of New Plymouth, where you do have buildings that you could effectively regenerate and including residential use within, without having to go through the whole process that you might face in a future urban zone. I suspect, though, that land prices might be a little bit different, but in terms of having opportunities already available within the urban footprint of New Plymouth to try this concept, that they're already there and they're already effectively zoned for you in a way.
And we are looking at more urban pieces of land which would require commercial investment or partnership on those pieces of land. So yeah, there's definitely opportunities, but with everything there's always a constraint or a different path to take to try and see it realized.
Yeah, so our initial, the reason for the bigger pieces of land was so that we could have gardens and open green spaces. But if we can't, I mean, this we're just exploring all options, which is why I put a very quick submission into this district plan, so we could come and speak to you.
Well, some of the latest technology involves vertical gardens, and I think New Zealand's even leading the way on it. I mean, you can have those permaculture situations within the fabric of old concrete buildings. Yeah. So
and anyway, on the roof as well. Yeah.
Yeah. All I can say is thanks for throwing this in for us to think about, because the innovation that can come out of these and the opportunities is great. So no, thank you for your time.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you, Kit. And look, I really interested in that discussion and that line of questioning. I must say for myself, it's a thing that our friends quite often joke about in terms of, wouldn't it be nice to have a much closer community spirit instead of rushing home in our little micro families and sort of doing our own thing. So I do thank you very much for bringing forward these thoughts, because planning is ever evolving. The government has said it under its national policy statement, urban development, big targets for getting more housing of all sorts in place. So I can really can see a place for this amongst our district plans. So really encourage the staff to think about this, particularly in the future urban zone, because will be planned. Those will be planned locations, which perhaps need to look at some of these aspects from a cultural perspective. I note your sort of comments about it being reasonably similar to perhaps some Maori living sort of beliefs about, you know, families of all ages, stages living together, and close living in terms of looking after each other. Just as another observation, my wife has an importing business, and we travel a lot around the world. In India, where we go a lot, some of the key people we work with, they live in family groups, so like a group of houses, for example, where mum and dad and the kids all have their own space, and a corridor out the back, which is all interconnected, and so they can pop in and out of each other's own personal spaces, and that works incredibly well for those people we do a lot of work with, and it's a very common living arrangement all around the world. So look, I thank you for your submission. Really appreciate you taking the time, Daniel, with that excellent submission, and wish you well in the future. We'll certainly consider how we might be able to fit this concept in, and really looking forward to how Denise and the other, I think it's Todd that's looking, he's a 42A officer for the future urban zone, just to see their response when they report back to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioners.
All right. Thank you, Christine. Have we heard back at all from Mr. Hendry?
Yes, he was just a little bit confused. He had been at the council office waiting, so he has advised me, that he's heading home and he's going to join, but I did advise him that we also had another submitter online to present, and we can fit him in after that.
Okay, so I think if he's not with us now, we're moving to Federated Farmers. Hilary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good morning, Commissioners.
Good morning.
I think Mark's on the lines. Oh, there we are. Hi, Mark.
Hey, Mark.
Hi.
Yeah. Yes, I will just speak through or talk through our prepared work, and then be open for questions. You'll have to excuse my delivery. We're about 7 days into a self-isolation situation at home here. So I apologise for that, but we should be fine. So my name is Eugene Walker. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor with Federated Farmers, and my role in this hearing is the submitter's representative and advocate. And as mentioned, Mark is our Taranaki Provincial President. He's with us today. So I reviewed the Section 42A reports written by Ms. Young for Hearing 17B, Rural Production Zone, and Ms. Y for the Rural Lifestyle Zone in relation to the proposed New Plymouth District Plan. And these reports address matters to which we made submissions and further submissions. And in accordance with the final procedures for hearing submissions, I have focused on areas of agreement and disagreement with the report writers, and have followed the same format and content lead as the Rural Production Zone 42A report. Any references relate to Ms. Young's report. So we were relatively comfortable with the notified provisions of the plan, which have been assigned to this hearing topic. Our generally supported submission was focused on the rural production zone and sought only relatively minor amendments to improve certainty. We made a number of further submissions, both in support and in opposition to changes being sought. With the exception of one rule and one objective, we are comfortable with the rationale provided by the report writers and where the Section 42A recommendations have landed on those submission and further submission points. Given the overriding areas of agreement, our attendance today is essentially in recognition of how important this hearing topic is for our members. The rural production zone is where their forebears lived, worked and played for generations before them, and where they, their children and grandchildren will do the same for generations to come. We are here to take any questions from the commissioners, but also consider it would be remiss of us not to take the opportunity at this point in the hearing schedule and in this hearing topic to make several points. Our support of the notified plan should in no way be interpreted as the plan going light on farming or farmers. Broad support of the notified plan was able to be extended because it provides a relatively good balance between resource use and resource protection. Our members want efficient and effective use of council resources. They understand functions and duties required under the Resource Management Act and can accept land use controls that are justifiable and defendable. Farms are highly regulated environments. All activities undertaken on farm within council's jurisdiction are subject to regulation, whether that be via permitted activity standards and conditions or through the consenting regime. And beyond the district plan, nothing can be discharged into the environment without it being enabled by the regional plan. Industry standards require a strict adherence to industry imposed environmental standards, and other legislation controls hazardous substances storage and use, animal welfare, and health and safety matters. There is no aspect of a farming business that does not have some degree of legislation or code of practice that is either already sitting on top of it or is proposed to be. When missing and where appropriate, we do advocate for non-regulatory methods to be used in the implementation mix, along with regulatory ones. In our experience, a suite of methods which includes non-regulatory incentives and methods improves the likelihood of achieving win-win outcomes for those resource management issues. The SASM chapter provides a useful example where FEDS accepts the consenting regime is appropriate for new farming infrastructure within identified sites, but not for the maintenance and repair of existing fences and tracks. We seek non-regulatory methods to provide some degree of recognition of the important role landowners who host these sites have to play as an addition to the regulatory ones. We want to acknowledge and support the recognition Council has given to the importance of primary production in the New Plymouth District and wider Taranaki region. Primary production activities make significant contributions toward the environmental, economic, social, and cultural well-being of communities. Now, focusing on the specific objective that we have remaining concerns with, I've got a snip there of the recommendations from the 42A report, but we partially oppose that objective. We had concerns with the ambiguity of the phrase intensification of land use and outlined our expectation that the objective outcome is to protect the rural zone from inappropriate urbanisation. Ms. Young confirmed in paragraph 185 that the intent of the objective is to manage buildings and the urbanisation of the rural environment. Now, whilst that confirmation of the objective outcome is appreciated, the recommended changes do not address our concerns and do not provide clarification as to the type of intensification the values listed are to remain uncompromised by. The recommended changes simply substitute how soil productivity and versatile land is described. We consider our amended changes are required to remove the ambiguity within the objective and better describe the activities which are proposed to be managed within the rural environment. And that's just an extract there of the original relief that was sought in our submission. I have included this section on the effect standards just on the back of the conversations that we had yesterday morning. And this relates to the effect standard 2 and stock loading yards. Now, we appreciate the intent of those consequential amendments into RPROZS2 is to provide some consistency with changes recommended to the entrance corridor chapter. And we certainly agree that stock loading yards should not be subject to the setback standards. However, if scope is an issue, we do consider that in the rural production zone, stock loading yards would be enabled by virtue of the new recommended number RPROZ R37. There is no equivalent rule for that in the entrance corridor. Now, our other issue relates to the keeping of goats, which you may be unsurprised to know. We made a submission in support of the controlled status of the notified rule. Support was extended in recognition of the New Plymouth District Plan's operative approach and the appeals on the proposed South Taranaki District Plan. The provisions of the notified plan are aligned with a consent order which resolved the Director General of Conservation's appeal point on this matter in 2017. Our interest essentially relates to the consent status, but we're also keen to ensure parties are clear that Council's intention is not to capture the intermittent pest management activity of rounding up feral goats and keeping them in a holding pen for a short period of time. The purpose of the rule is to manage farm goats. Now, I will just say, Mark's made a good point to me this morning that this clarification around the keeping of goats and the feral goat issue is only really going to be a problem if the planning approach is extended beyond the national park. So as recommended, it's not particularly an issue, but as mentioned, if that approach does get extended beyond the national park, then it does come into play, more importantly. So with regards to the consent status, Ms. Young has recommended the activity status changes from controlled to restricted discretionary to support a submission made by the Director General of Conservation. No changes have been made to the matters that an applicant would need to comply with. We do not agree that an elevation in consent status is required to achieve the goals that everyone wants. Ms. Young makes it very clear that the intention of the operative plan is to prevent farmed goats escaping and causing damage to Indigenous biodiversity within Te Papakura o Tanaki's boundary, and that the rule carries over from the operative rule RU-R70. Now, following discussion on issues relating to feral goats, Ms. Young reasons at paragraph 515 that Council should retain discretion to decline an application if the fencing does not meet the requirements of the fencing standard, thereby lessening the risk of farm goats escaping into the national park. We submit that the same outcome can be achieved under the control status by virtue of the same fencing standard conditions that are applied. South Taranaki's controlled activity status is designed to achieve the same outcome, and we understand they have had no issues with the planning approach over the last 5 years. It is worth reminding parties there is quite a distinct difference between domesticated goats and feral goats, not in terms of the damage they will do to vegetation, but in terms of their behaviours. A goat-proof fence is an industry design standard, and with good maintenance and repair, it will hold domesticated goats. A determined feral goat is quite another matter, and the evidence around the difficulty of containing them is supported. We are also highly supportive of the pest management work being undertaken by DOC. Our members know firsthand the damage that feral goats, pigs and deer do to our Indigenous vegetation. Efforts to fully eradicate pests from public estates are well worth celebrating, and we understand the desire to lock in those gains. But with respect, unless public areas are fenced to a pest-proof standard, then eradication is perhaps an unrealistic goal. Even if farmed goats was prohibited, what is to stop hunters releasing goats, pigs and deer into the national park? And now, as mentioned, this following point does relate to the keeping of goats. Excuse me. So we might, sorry, just a minute.
Hey, Kelly, just take your time. If you need to have a wee break, glass of water.
Sorry. I feel like I'm out the other side of COVID, but we'll see.
So have you tested positive, Hillary? Are you part of the lockdown in your house?
I am. Now, I can assure you the kids came through it within about 24 hours, and the adults are faring a little bit worse. But anyway, it does sound worse than it is. But so I apologise for being overly dramatic.
No. We understand it's a fact of life for many families now. So we appreciate the fact you can actually even talk with us. So
No, it's okay. No, like I say, it isn't as bad as it sounds. Okay. Right. So we make the point about the rule only applying to goat farming, because in what can only be assumed to have been a formatting issue, the operative Rule 70 was not carried over exactly. And unfortunately, the portion that is missing was important for providing certainty. So for ease of reference, the full header of Rule 70 reads, any goat owned, farmed or otherwise kept shall be confined by a goat-proof fence or other suitable enclosure, or otherwise shall be securely tethered. Every prospective goat farmer shall before commencing a goat farming operation, shall then meet the list of standards that was required. So it's clear that the operative rule was only going to apply to goat farming. And Council considers that the notified rule will also only apply to goat farming. However, taken in isolation, the term keeping of goats could have wider application. In undertaking their own pest management, some hill country farmers will periodically round up and keep feral goats penned in either a holding paddock or pen for short periods of time. And it would be highly disingenuous if parties took advantage of the fact that the keeping of goats has not been defined within the plan, so to suggest that that type of activity was being contemplated by the notified plan. Now, we note that there are several amendments which have been recommended by Ms. Young, which do not have scope in submissions, but can be considered as minor in matter, as they do not change the intent of the rule. And that's under, in paragraphs 520 and 521. We ask for the same logic to be applied to the name of this rule and amend the rule header for RPROZ R9 and RLZ R11 from keeping of goats to goat farming. We think that will remove any potential for the intentions of this rule to be frustrated going forward. And as an alternative remedy, it could be that an advice note could be added, which makes the rule explicit. I won't go through again that relatively amateur section 32AA evaluation, except to say that we consider our intentions are aligned with the notified plan and are really relatively minor. I have just put our proposed amendments there, and I apologise for not having included the appendix, which has the full track version of the notified, of the recommendations. I will do that. I just hadn't had a chance to convert it into a Word document. So it is a bit clunky, that proposed amendments at the bottom, but I guess it also just reiterates that we aren't asking for particularly significant changes at all across this chapter. So that ends my formal bit, and whether or not Mark would like to add anything, I'm not sure.
No, happy to take questions on that.
Hilary, if you could just, if you do have an update, just get that through to Christine as a replacement, and we'll put that online so that certainly the staff and we have the full
Sure.
for you. But you are suggesting, apart from those amendments, some other amendments, aren't you, particularly in relation to your paragraph 16? Is that, are you still seeking that amendment to
Yes, sorry, yes, so to the objective, and and I have included that down the very bottom. Yeah, because those amendments are, that is the
yes, you've got
exact.
that. Sorry, yes, yeah, no, I see that. Yeah, no, apologies for that. All right, I've got a couple of questions, but we'll start with Kit, who's very interested in goats.
Only because I'm scared of them. Thanks for that, Hilary, and good to see you again. And Mark, I'm sad to say you got COVID, but most people, I know a lot of people at the moment who are in the same boat, and I think we'll get through it all. So you do sound okay for someone who's had it, so that's quite encouraging for those of us who haven't. Just a couple of questions around goats. I guess the first one, and Mark might be able to jump in. What's the extent of goat farming in the New Plymouth district that you're aware of?
Yeah, I must say, Mark might need to answer that. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers, but there are a number of dairy goat operations in the district. They have there has been a bit of consolidation, I guess, over the years. There used to be quite a higher number of smaller operations, and the trend at present is towards a greater level of housing and cut and carry methods for goats due to various difficulties in terms of feet and management and what have you. And so that's tended to eliminate some of the smaller ones that were located, perhaps more around the centre of the district through the Inglewood region and that sort of thing. And so some of those have gone, and there's been consolidation to sort of larger housed units. So exactly what the numbers are, I don't know, but there are still a good number of these, reasonably significant operations.
So in terms of the products you get from goats, is there any sort of predominance, or is that constantly changed? Obviously, you've got goat wool, you've got goat milk that gets presumably into goat. That's what you referred to as dairy goat operations. And then presumably, is there a market for goat flesh?
Yes, yes, there is, but you know, the farms, the farmed goats concentrate pretty much exclusively on dairy goat operations.
Okay.
And so so any meat is a you know, kind of a product of a normal herd management in terms of culling and replacement rate. And then there is also a bit of a supplementary market where Hillary's mentioned, for example, feral goats having been rounded up, and from time to time when numbers get large, hill country farmers will round them up and they can put a run through the works for that goat meat if that's organised in advance. And so there is a bit of a market for it, but it's not a, you know, significant industry in and of itself.
That must be fun, rounding up feral goats.
Oh, that's a dogs.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
the
a-
dog. Oh, these are the
You've got to have a
dogs.
full team of
Quite
well-trained
special,
dogs.
yeah, specialist team.
Yeah, my father used to round them up with a shotgun. That was much more effective, he said. But okay, the specialist dogs. That's interesting. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that. That is very helpful. Hillary, I just want to come back to the point you make about the difference between the operative regime and the current rule, and what it is we're actually wanting this rule to apply to.
Yeah.
I don't immediately understand how you say that Rural 70, the one you quote at 26,
Yeah.
is intended only to apply to goat farming, because the first phrase is very broad. Any goat owned, farmed, or otherwise kept
Yeah.
shall be confined to goat-proof fencing. Presumably goat-proof fencing is defined so
Yes.
that anyone who owns a goat, even just one goat, would effectively have to make sure it's fenced, wouldn't they?
My understanding of the operative plan, and I guess the point is that next part of the rule, which says every
Yeah.
goat perspective, you know, goat farmer shall be required to meet those conditions before their operation starts. So I
Okay.
guess that's that part of the rule that I think is, so I agree with you, that first part
It's a
quite
bit
broad.
ambiguous, really, isn't it?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I believe the focus comes in that second sentence, because it makes a nonsense of it if you're not, you know, talking about goat farming.
Well, but does it? Because even if I own one goat, it's the family goat, I can still comply with the rule by just making sure it's securely tethered.
Oh, yes. So yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah. No, and I think that, so that is the intention of that part. I guess it's the broader goat farming intention that's
Yeah.
come over from that.
So
rule.
it's your view that what these two rules are really trying to deal with is not the keeping of goats singular or for whatever purpose. It's for those farmers who want to actually use them as a herd for some sort of primary production. That's all we should be worried about.
Well, my understanding is that's all that council's worried about, and they've made that clear in the 42A report recommendation, or the discussion in that document and the operative plan, with regards to those conditions that apply to the farming operation.
Okay. Oh, well, I'll be interested to hear what Ms. Young's of the same view, because if that's
Sure.
the case, then it probably does make sense to be quite specific about it, because otherwise, yes, anyone who keeps a goat has arguably got to put up a 9-wire fence, because as far as I see it, there's no option anymore just to securely tether, is there?
No, that's true. Yeah.
No. In the case of the farmers who do the feral goat roundups, presumably they would keep them in an enclosure that is relatively escape proof as well, wouldn't they?
Yep.
Yeah.
And they're not held for long necessarily, but sometimes it can be to bring them into, I mean, feral goats can also behave in a relatively domesticated way. It just, it depends on a number of variables, really.
Yeah,
and
when you get a big mob of them together like that,
Yeah.
they're probably reasonably settled. Just if they get isolated, they'll jump anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as I say, it relates to because it's not a the meat processing is not a you know, an ongoing industry sector, that they would have to organise, you know, a large mob to come together to put a run through the works, for example.
Yeah.
So
If we are confining the rule to goat farming in the sense of keeping of a herd of goats, and they ought to be fenced, do you think there needs to be anything to deal with the, you know, the family that just has the family goat?
Well,
Do you
I
think-
understand. Sorry, I understand there is a bylaw that can address that in the urban space. Whether that needs to be or should be applied into the rural one, I don't know that we necessarily have an opinion on, to be honest. I note from Doc's evidence that there obviously is an issue with, well, there seems to be an issue with escaped pets.
Mm.
We don't have any. I don't know of any evidence to, you know, that would correlate, corroborate with that. Sorry, I can't get my mouth around that. But so, but as I said, you know, we fully appreciate the damage goats do. So it's not, we're not disagreeing and not understanding the issue. It's just how it's.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I mean, that's something I'll talk with Doc about, because you know, segregating the rule into goat farming and just, you know, making sure that anyone who keeps a goat keeps it secure and tethered and on their property. You're right. It might be a bylaw matter. It might not be worth even putting anything into a district plan to deal with it. It seems a little bit over the top. But anyway, we have lots of rules for lots of things that I imagine aliens look down on us and go, why the hell would they regulate that? But anyway, we don't need to go there. The other thing I just wanted to say is I take your point, because it's one I raised with Ms. Young yesterday, that there doesn't seem to be, if there's a controlled activity standard and that has to be met to be able to get the benefit of the control rule, you know, I think you picked up on the same point. What does making it restricted discretionary really add to it, when it would become that anyway if you didn't provide for the fencing? So I mean, that's something I'll talk a little bit more about with Doc to see what their view on the necessity for it seems. I mean, from my perspective, you need to, this needs to be an activity that engenders a greater risk than even in a fenced state that requires a higher activity status, because otherwise what are you trying to achieve?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Hilary, and I understand we're not going to see you again.
Yeah, no, so so thanks for that. I didn't know whether I should mention anything or not, because so this will be the last time I present to the panel and in this process, which is going to be interesting for me. I must say I really thoroughly enjoyed it, you know, which may be a strange thing to say, but I don't want to make it sound condescending, that's all, but want to really acknowledge the commissioners and you, Chairman Daish. It's been, I've been involved in a few of these processes, but this one is definitely going to be a standout in terms of the way Julie and Christine have, from all that organisation space, the moving parts that must be behind the scenes of this kind of system and process are, phenomenal. So just huge credit to those ladies who've done a fantastic job all the way through. The environment that you commissioners have created for us submitters, I think you've made it incredibly open and able to be, you've been very accommodating and allowed us all to exercise our own personalities and flavors and done so with a lot of respect, and allowed us to feel like we're making really meaningful contributions to a really important process. And then I really cannot go actually without acknowledging the iwi submitters that have engaged in this process in such an incredibly robust and thorough way. I've never seen anything like it before, and I've been in awe actually, because I know the resources that go into this plan, so into this planning process in particular. So the caliber of those iwi submissions and the generosity of spirit that they've entered into this process in can only be recommended. highly, acknowledged. So, and on that, we come into this process not being particularly clear about what iwi submitters were looking for from the plan. We're not in any shadow of a doubt now as to how this, how iwi submitters are looking for this plan, or what they're looking for from this plan going forward. And so I acknowledge that, and and appreciate that open and transparency that this process has been engaged with. So I don't know if that's what I've been going on a little bit, but so light is at the end of the tunnel, and for everyone really, and Fed's interests are going to be well looked after without me in the seat for a little bit. We've got Peter Maddich, who'll be standing in for the hearings for the remaining ones, and he's a experienced planner. And we're really excited that there's a new policy advisor that will be based in Taranaki that's taking up the role. So I think that's going to be hugely important actually going forward as we try and bed this plan down, because implementing it is what we're all looking forward to doing, I think, in a really positive and proactive way. So having someone based locally to help support Mark and the exec team and our members I'm really pleased that me stepping aside has almost helped create that situation. So so no, it's all good.
Oh, all right, thanks for that.
Okay.
And thank you. Look, I think Kit's well and truly covered any of the ground that I wanted to cover. Hilary and Mark, I think it's particularly important for us that Mark, you've been following us closely as the chair, the local chair. You're obviously very interested in planning and all of the factors of the environment, and having you there to ask practical questions of has been great. I know, Hilary, you're from a farming family as well, so it's for me it's that practical hands-on knowledge and interest in these plans, because these plans, they are incredibly important. They're difficult sometimes to get for lay people to get their head into and around, but if we can get the plan as useful as possible based on good evidence, good reasons, hopefully a lot of people won't need to interface too much with it, just getting on with their day-to-day lives. So Hilary, just want to thank you for being part of our sort of hearing family. We certainly get to meet a number of people a number of times through these hearings, and it's been a real pleasure, an absolute pleasure having you involved with us. Your style and approach is very refreshing, and just want to acknowledge you and wish you well in the future. I do know Peter Maddich quite well myself, so he's going to be another familiar face, and we'll carry on with him. So thank you very much, Hilary, and go well.
Yeah, thank you. All the best.
So I think Mr. Hendry. Mr. Hendry is back with us now, so we'll just hear from you now, Rex, if you can come online.
Yeah, kia ora tātou. Ko Rex Hendry taka ingoa, I noho kāinga mai o ku tupuna ki Taranaki, ko Tamandra ti Kaipuki, ko Taranaki ti Manga I Tūnei, ko Waifakaio ti Wai, I Riri nei, ko Taranaki te whenua I Takatū nei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora tātou. I'm sorry about the earlier confusion. I hadn't quite picked up that this was now Zoom only, and I spent about half an hour sitting outside the Plymouth room at the MPDC just before 9 this morning. However, I should be fairly brief. Certainly the tenure has changed of the original submission, because in the last 2 years things are moving on. We've had COVID, of course. We've had several reports from the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, and you'll note on my recent one-pager that I had left off sea level rise. So if you look at some of the reports that are coming out around sea level rise, there's somewhere between 1 and 4 metres of sea level rise in the next 100 years, somewhere between 5 and 11 in the 200-year range. So if you combine that with predicted heavier precipitation, flood events and inundation is now going to be the norm. So that changes my original perspective, really. I was looking at better use of small holding land in the rural sector, but if you factor all that in together, there needs to be a shift in thinking. Certainly the strategy for residential property going forward, maybe one of the strategies going up and not out, maybe increasing housing densities in the urban sector, but I'm suggesting now that small holdings in rural sector may be also an opportunity and an untapped resource, in fact. Currently, the residential rule in the previous district plan allows for 2 dwellings on sites, and the new one proposes 1 or at best 1 plus a sleep out. Now, I'm suggesting that, as I've said, that there does need to be a paradigm shift to look at these the available land that is maybe 10-acre blocks, previous 10-acre blocks, lifestyle blocks, and smaller. There may be the potential for rejuvenating the rural population as well, which there's been an urban shift in the last generation or so, 2 or 3 generations. So I'm saying that this paradigm shift that's required should rethink small holding land in the rural sector, and not only should it allow for repopulation and reuse of this land for residential, but it should enable and encourage that. Now, I've, in both sort of papers I've put in a few numbers. Planners seem to like numbers, so I'll put a few numbers in there. What I've suggested might be reasonable, but certainly the background for using small holding land for subdivision or increased residential and dwellings still apply. You know, it saves subdivision of larger farms. It provides for on-site accommodation for workers and other family members. It allows for more than one family on a site and next generation use of sites, particularly potentially horticultural sites, but also just in terms of residential dwellings anyway, and so forth. So those still apply, and that's pretty much the guts of the presentation to you, really, is that I believe that there is room for the plan to have a paradigm shift and rethink the way it uses small holding land in the district, so that they can be used for higher or more residential dwellings in the rural sector. So that's pretty much it. Any questions?
We'll just kick off with Kit to see whether he has any questions.
Yeah, look, Mr. Hendry, I read your statement with interest. I appreciate the work you put into it, and we've obviously got some fairly clear directions from the council around how they want the rural production zone and its purpose to sort of almost overshadow the use of it for residential. So you've got a little bit of opposition there from the council planners, but that doesn't mean that the ideas you've got are invalid, and certainly they're things that we're going to think about, because there is a lot of rural land in the district and there is a lot of things that could be done with it. We've just got to keep in mind what the overall framework is that the council wants to achieve. But I mean, beyond that, I appreciate the effort you put into it. Thanks very much.
Yeah, well, maybe I could reiterate and reinforce the fact that I think people are currently planners as well are underestimating the impact of climate change, sea level rise, flood and inundation, and there does need to be some relief in the system to provide for the displacement and transient populations, which are surely heading our way. And now's the time to start planning for those things, not in the next iteration of the plan, not in the one after that, but now is actually the time to start planning for that. And I can't emphasize that enough, really.
No.
Rex, you seem to be incredibly well read in the area of climate change and future effects. Is that part of your job, or is that just an interest you have?
Well, I was almost going to jump into the previous conversation. In actual fact, I am a ex-area manager for the Department of Conservation here in Taranaki. Over the last 40 odd years, I've done a lot of my working life has been in the Antarctic, and I've done 25 trips down there working alongside climate change scientists throughout that whole period. So I know firsthand what the science is that's going into some of these figures that are now coming through the IPCC. And I would have to say that the scientists that I work with have to moderate the language they use. They're dependent on funding cycles, and so therefore they have to be careful and moderate what they say and how they present their information. But every time they revisit the information, it seems to be exponentially worse than previously predicted or the previous models were suggesting. So, I have got that knowledge of climate change. Coincidentally, I'm also currently researching and writing a thesis, a master's thesis on resilience and adaptability for local government in this context of climate change and ongoing disruption like earthquakes, volcanoes, mosque attacks, whatever else you've got. So yes, I think I'm pretty well read at this stage here and pretty current.
Yeah, Rex, I really, it's great to meet you actually, because outside of this role I have chairing this hearing, most of my other work is in the space of climate change, impact assessment and adaptation processes. So, it's certainly not lost on me the need for planners to be thinking about the real planning issues that are going to arise, and some of them are going to arise quicker than anyone perhaps thinks in our planning framework. So overlaying this advice and with the new AP6 version coming out of the IPCC in terms of their report, it's a very immediate issue. We will be dealing with this in the natural hazards and the coastal chapter particularly, which in the New Plymouth district situation with sea level rise, climate change, erosion potential, those sorts of things are sort of on your doorstep, as you know from living in Taranaki. So certainly do appreciate you highlighting this, and certainly for the team of planners at the District Council really having their eye on the ball on this in a policy sense. So I did have one specific question. You seem to be suggesting that there might be some sort of a body of land resource in the district that has already sort of moved past the productive unit, for use as and this is a hoary old chestnut in terms of planning practice. What is an economic unit? If you don't have an economic unit, is it better to use the resource for, say, housing or other uses rather than trying to just have a whole bunch of 10-acre blocks all over the place, which aren't really doing much for anyone? Is that part of your thinking, that there is a resource there of unproductive uses that might be an asset for the future of the district? Absolutely, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. And I could refer back to the Venture Taranaki report on horticulture that was produced about 8, 9, 10 years ago that basically suggests that until the distribution problem is solved for Taranaki, in other words, getting produce to market, these small land holdings are becoming less
financially viable. And once again, if I can refer to a personal example, for the last 17, 18 years, I've been growing garlic here as a crop. And then exponentially over the last, over the previous 5 years, the climate is changing, particularly our springs are becoming overcast, more moist, and gradually the fungi load in the crop was unsustainable. And 5 years ago, I lost 100% of the crop to fungus. And of course, as you know, once you get fungus in the soil, it's unproductive. So, you know, I've had to rip all of that out and replant in other crops, citrus and pip fruit, to sit and now wait for that to come online. So had there been an opportunity to reutilise that land, particularly as my children now have got to adults, and, you know, I could have brought them home and they could have helped me on the land. And, you know, there's all those other things that personally could have advantaged me had there been more wiggle room in the rules for residential dwellings on these small holdings. And yes, I suggest that if, I haven't done an inventory by far, but I would suggest there are lots of small parcels, ex-10 acre blocks, subdivisions, that are becoming available. And yet I also see farmers with large farms who can then justify the balance of land and farming that carve off land for small holdings. So, you know, there is I think, room to relax the position on that area. In fact, as I say, I think a whole paradigm shift is required to look at those small parcels. And there are, as we know, some of the smaller hamlets or smaller villages around the region that do have parcels of land, ex-residential areas that were, you know, let me think of some, well, I can't quite think of them, but some of the small places like, I guess, Midhurst, where there are residential parcels of land where people could easily rebuild and move and potentially subdivide some of that area to make revitalise those rural communities as well, and rural settlements. So yes, I think there is something there. I'd be interested to see if the council had resources to do inventory to see what was available there, but I would suggest anecdotally that yes, there is.
Yes, certainly a lot of food for thought. I think you are giving us the counterfactual to the planning team, who are basically saying, look, we've had, with the effects-based plan and the operative plan, proliferation of housing all over, particularly near New Plymouth, and from a planning perspective, particularly around rural character and sort of perhaps some reverse sensitivity effects of housing near productive land, needing more protection from, you know, effects. You're giving us the opposite sort of advice, I suppose, and it's always good to have these sort of planning policies or precepts challenged, and you've certainly given us some food for thought. So thank you very much again, Rex, and certainly we may come across each other again if we're focusing on this space. It's a very, I've always said to my team that outside of water resources, which has been consuming the planning fraternity allocation and water quality for the last 10 years, climate change effects and how we plan ahead is the biggest challenge facing the I suppose planners who are thinking ahead. That's our job. So really appreciate your involvement.
No worries.
Okay, well, I think we're finished for the morning. We can all go and have a cup of tea, and we're back at 2 o'clock. Are there any questions from anyone in the meantime? Okay, let's adjourn till 2 p.m. We'll be back online then. Thank you very much. Yes, welcome back to our 2 o'clock session. Apologies for being a bit late. I'm cycling between my home office where I'm sitting to have some peace and quiet in my office in town, so just miscalculated the drive home a bit. But hopefully we're all here. I'm just bringing up the schedule, Christine. Is it Helen Johnson up first? Just double checking.
You said it's correct, Stephen.
Yes, Helen, welcome.
Oops. Come on. Oh, right. Okay, got it. Sorry about that.
Thanks for your notes, Helen, which we've received this morning. I've been thinking with your submissions, they're very much in the plan practitioner, good working plan basis. And I'm thinking it would be quite good to have the staff team sort of in the loop in terms of just asking any sort of questions or clarifications. They are quite technical planning issues. So while Kit and I will lead questioning, Denise and Louise, if you do have any questions yourselves of clarification through me, I'm very happy for you to make those as we go along. So what do you think about that, Denise?
I think that would be useful. Thank you.
Yes. Is it just you've got some comments on all of the 3 zones, I think, Helen, that's right, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yes, so just turn your cameras on, Denise, Todd and Louise, and certainly if there's any queries or clarifications you have as Helen presents or as we ask questions, that would be you're most welcome. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you. So there are a number of points where I actually agree with the recommendations in the planning report, so I'm not going to touch on those. The matters that I disagree with span the zones that are the subject of this hearing, so I'm pulling those together and addressing them by way of topic. So the first topic that I have is the one of building activities, and this relates to the rural production zone and the rural life science zone. And in the summary of my speaking notes, I've noted where in my evidence in chief those matters are discussed. So fundamentally, I still am of the opinion that despite the changes from an effects-based plan to an activities-based plan, the inclusion of rules pertaining to erection, alteration, etc. could be dealt with through the effects standard. However, given the structure that's been adopted, I've limited my discussion to those rules in the residential zone and rural zone chapters which link the status of building activities to the status of the use to which the building structure would be put. And that's within the rural zone rules and the residential zone rules. As illustrated in Appendix 1 to my evidence, these zones are the only ones in which this approach has been adopted. And given the arguments in the Section 42A report about the purpose of these rules, I consider that they could be reworded. So I've just suggested a rewording in Appendix 1B, which aligns with the way that these have been dealt with in other chapters. Do you want me to stop at the end of each topic?
I think so, Helen, and I'm not sure whether the staff team have had time to sort of think about this or whether there's any immediate feedback. This seems to be a consistency issue, Denise.
I just have a question. In your evidence of chief, you actually suggested that we delete the rule, and then in your appendix, you suggest rewording. I'm just wondering what would be your preference? And
to be honest, my preference would be across the board deletion of the rules that pertain to building structures, those erection of buildings, erection of structures. However, I only submitted on the ones for the rural and residential zone, and fundamentally about the disconnect with the way that they were structured. So what I'm asking to come out of this hearing is that you change it per 1B, Appendix 1B, rather than delete it entirely. It's kind of like a middle ground, if you like.
Okay, Kit, did you have any questions on this one? Maybe turn your mic on there, buddy.
There we go. The most frequently used phrase in the world at the moment. You're on mute. I was going to say, I'm just a lowly lawyer, and I must say you deep dive into this stuff, Helen, in a way which I must say is very impressive. The question I had around this one was really how it is that you believed that the rules were entirely superfluous.
You always ask tricky questions. I mean, at hearing 2, I presented to the panel about how I felt the plan could be restructured so that, to my mind, it was a bit more easy to understand, with activities such as residential uses, rural uses, commercial uses listed in the rules, and all of the effect standards being contained within the effects standards part of the district plan. So under the operative district plan, we have, if it's effects based, we don't list types of activities, but we control things like the erection of buildings relocation through those effects standards. And so I felt that that's how that could be dealt with. But I accept that the interim advice from the panel is that the structure will stay how it is. And so the suggestion that I've included in 1B is seeking to fit within that structure.
Yeah. Okay. No, I accept that. And it might be something Ms. Young can clarify. I had anticipated that the reason for there to be to separate, because sorry, this, I don't know if you heard that. Even on level 7 in the CBD, it gets a bit noisy when the motorcycles go past. I accept that there is a need, or the theory behind the segregation between activities per se having a status, i.e. activities in the sense of doing things, with buildings, which are essentially a form of activity, but they are sort of different from a use of land. I can understand why, and I'm certainly familiar with plans where the status of the latter follows the status of the former. So, for example, if you're undertaking a controlled activity, then a building that's associated with it is also controlled. And I think there's a general approach to that in the plans I'm familiar with. In this scenario, I get the sense, though, that the council want to identify the buildings separately and give them a different status. And again, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, because of this concern that if buildings per se are permitted, they might get built and then co-opted for an activity that might otherwise require resource consent, and then council's confronted with an argument by the person who wants to do the activity to say, hey, look, there's no effect on rural character because the building's already there, and therefore you should just let me go about doing what I want to do in my building. Like, for example, someone who builds a big barn in the rural production zone, or a building that looks like a barn, does so as a permitted activity, and then subsequently comes along later and wants to convert it into a school. You know, just crazy example. Do you perceive that degree of regulation is necessary to maintain the rural character of the zone, or should we just let permitted buildings be permitted buildings, and if people can repurpose them for uses that don't have any other effects in the zone, then we should just not bother?
Who was that question for?
It was predominantly at you. I wanted to get a
Oh,
sense of
sorry.
whether you, sorry, it probably came across as a bit of a ramble, because I wanted to get your sense of whether you understood that that's what council were trying to do with the segregation of activity status between the structure versus an activity.
I see where you're coming from, and in the example that you gave, for example, of a barn then being wanted to be used for a school, then they would require consent to do that, and presumably that activity, if it needs consent, is listed as requiring consent because it has other effects other than associated with the actual structure itself that are undesirable in, for example, the rural production area. So that might be noise, that might be traffic and transport, all sorts of things. And so, I mean, one of the things that Ms. Young put in her report related to the fact that there will be instances where buildings are constructed and you don't necessarily know the use. If they put up a barn, they will presumably apply for a building consent as a barn, and then we're reliant on recognising that that use gets changed in order to trigger that consent requirement. So that's where I sit on that.
Yeah. So you take the view that if the building's able to get, if there's a change of use of a building that was established as a permitted activity, then that activity and its effects will go through the assessment at the time the change of use occurs. And the fact that the building's already there just means that there's one potential issue with that activity that doesn't need to be assessed because the building's already there.
That's correct, because if the building meets the building standards,
yep,
then it should be not part of the consideration.
Yeah, look, I think I've certainly got some sympathy with the approach, because it's very difficult to compel people to demonstrate or only use a permitted building for a permitted activity ultimately. So your proposition is a sort of a halfway house, really, isn't it? Keeps the structure, but doesn't do away with the need for separate or different control over the buildings per se.
So what I've tried to do is align it with the other chapters. So yeah, as I said, it's only rural and residential where this distinction is made, and I'm not sure why that was the case. And so by realigning it back with those other chapters, you still have a rule that relates to the erection, alteration, etc. of buildings, but that's permitted subject to meeting the relevant criteria, and also, if you know what the use of the activity is going to be, to meeting the permitted, having a permitted activity utilise that.
Okay. Yeah. All right, now I've got that. Denise, Louise, did you want to have any comment on this sort of conversation? No.
Okay.
Okay.
I see Campbell has joined, who's reporting on the residential zones, I understand. So this will be that's coming up. So you'll be addressing the same points, obviously. And if we're dealing with this issue across the rural and residential zones, Campbell and Denise and the team here will have to liaise on these suggestions. Campbell, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Good afternoon, everybody. For those who don't know me, Campbell Robinson. I'm an independent consultant, and I'm working for council on the residential chapters and also the design guides chapters. So, yeah, very interested in the discussion that's gone on. Certainly taking note of that, and yeah, we'll be very much addressing it as part of my report.
Thank you just for checking in, Campbell, and for obviously anticipating this issue. So that's great. Helen, I don't have any further questions. So do you like to move to the next point?
Certainly. Before I do, it would be really useful if the reporting planners could actually put something in their right of reply about why there is that difference. between the chapters. I'd find that useful anyway. I mean, so moving on, the next topic is keeping of goats, and I submitted on the rural production zone in regard to this matter. I had two main issues with the rule as written, both in terms of the way it was written in the notified version and with the changes that Ms Young has recommended. As structured, the rules make sites where goats are kept located further than 2 kilometres away from the boundary of Te Papakura or Taranaki discretionary, and that should actually be restricted discretionary, I think, in that they don't meet criteria 1. And the suggestion by Ms Young that they apply the same status where the effect standards are not met. So again, I've included some suggested rewording for this that I think addresses those issues. And I note that those could, if they're acceptable, they could also be applied to the rural lifestyle and future urban zones. That's it for that one.
Yeah, I thought that was I hadn't picked up on the way the rule was phrased, and I see where you're coming from now. So if it's actually easier to be, effectively it would mean that all keeping of goats is going to require a resource consent, and there's no real difference depending on whether you're within 2 kilometres or out, just simply because of the way the rule's phrased. Yeah, okay. I see that as a, yeah. Do you have any particular view on the status, or are you just, you're not a submitter on that particular point?
I'm not a submitter on that point.
Do you think there's any room within your suggested rule to incorporate, because I guess that's the other thing that I picked up. Sorry, let me find your suggestion. Where's your suggested rule, Helen?
And the evidence.
Yeah. Oh no, sorry, you did put it right up the front there. Okay, yeah. Do you think though that, I mean, I understand your reasoning there. Do you think though that by making the permitted activity also have to comply with the effect standards defeats the purpose? Because one of the effect standards is that if you're keeping goats, you have to meet the fencing requirements.
As I understand it, one of the requirements for keeping goats in order to avoid them having impacts is to keep them fenced. But yes. I see your point in that you could be a substantial distance from the national park and still be required to fence them. Yeah. I guess I'd be interested to find out where that recommendation came from and whether it was specifically intended to apply within that 2 kilometre radius. It's not my area of expertise, I have to admit.
Okay. I think the recommendation to change the status was essentially out of the Department of Conservation submission. And I don't know whether they picked up on the issue that you've identified with the rule, which is the way it's phrased. If you don't meet the first criterion, then you still need a resource consent, i.e. you could be farming goats or keeping goats outside 2 kilometres. So that's something that is particular to what you've picked up. And I've simply then said, well, I get the point, and this potentially fixes it, but does it if you've also got to comply with the rural production zone effect standards anyway? And I wonder whether there's another way of constructing it so that it's quite clear that the keeping of goats beyond 2 kilometres does not have to comply with the fencing standards. Although to some extent, given how much of a potential pest these things can become, you might want to think that they're going to get fenced anyway. So let's just specify a fencing standard, but then what's the point of having a rule that makes goat farming beyond 2 kilometres and one within 2 kilometres? What's the distinction at that point? So yeah, look, I don't have a question. I don't have an answer. I think you've made a good point about the application of the rule, and maybe there's an elegant way to fix it.
I take your point.
Let's carry on to the next point, Helen. And just noting that I see you raised in your evidence that you've expressed concern in hearing 10 about consequential changes. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yes. So neither that was the energy and transport hearing, I think.
General industrial zone and open space. So Mr. Fringley and Ms. Gibson.
Okay. So I was involved in that. So yes, just carry on and go through your point here.
So I understand that this is a bit of a tricky one because it is an across the plan submission, and having had it deferred from hearing 2 and asking the planners to individually address it through their hearings does make it tricky to ensure that there's across the board consistency. And I am aware that it's going to be dealt with at the sweep up hearing. I'm thinking that maybe that's the best place for all of the consideration around the points that I'm trying to make with regard to structures and buildings to be heard, perhaps, rather than getting everybody to address it individually. One of the points I did want to make about consequential changes is that they don't come up in Appendix 2, so it's really hard for me to know whether they've been addressed or not by looking at that appendix to the Section 42 reports. I pretty much have to go in and search on my name and in my submission number to pick them up. So just going through my summary with regard to the rural production zone, rural lifestyle zone and the future urban zone, with regard to maximum heights, both Ms. Young and Ms. Y consider that the standards as written are clear, and I concur with them on that regard. So I don't think that there are any changes to be made to the S1 standards for those zones. I note that it's not considered, these submission points aren't considered in the future urban zone hearing, and that in the rules for the future urban zone, the title of the standard refers to buildings only, while the criteria actually refer to buildings and structures. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. In my evidence in chief, I did suggest that I would be interested in getting feedback about which has priority, because that could affect how my submissions applied in terms of perhaps making changes to achieve that consistency. With regard to the height in relation to boundary rules, Ms. Young considers the standard as written as clear, and I also agree with that. I have to apologise for an error in reading Ms. Y's report. I read the second part of that paragraph as referring to height in relation to boundary, but she's actually talking about setbacks. As for both the rural and the rural production zone and the future urban zone, I consider the height and relation boundaries for the rural lifestyle zone to be clear. So I don't think that they need to be changed. Having said that, I acknowledged in my evidence that the nature of submissions means that sometimes they are quite brief and that you can't get a bit of context within a short submission or a summary of a submission. So I took the opportunity of that error, not knowing it was an error at the time, to flesh out my concerns regarding the issues that I have with height and height in relation to boundary standards. To reiterate, the intent of my submission was to address inconsistencies in the wording used between the chapters, as I've illustrated in Appendix 1 to my speaking notes for hearing 10. As noted by Ms. Young and illustrated in paragraph 34 of my evidence, there are also cases where there are inconsistencies within the criteria themselves. And Ms. Young actually used the example of the setbacks, which is, as I understand it, why setbacks have been brought into these hearings. Where the term structure and buildings are used together, it could seem like structures and buildings are separate things, which when in fact buildings are a subset of structures per the definition in the Act. I recently read the Section 42A report for the hospital zone and note that the reporting planners recognise this inconsistency in regard to the maximum height rules compared to the maximum, the height in relation to boundary rules, which refers to any buildings and structures. And they've actually made a recommendation that that inconsistency be removed. I included this because I felt like they got the gist of what I was trying to raise in my submission. With specific regard to the matter of the standards for height in relation to boundary, I've included an analysis of the manner in which these rules are applied, both in the text of my evidence and in Appendix 3. Most, as per the operative district plan, apply to buildings only in recognition of their bulk. And I would note that I think that that's an appropriate restriction to buildings only. However, as noted in my evidence, there are some zones where the standards are not applied at all and others where they apply in the actual zone standard as to being applied to structures, but with cross-referencing other rules, other standards in other zones where the height in relation to boundary standard only applies to buildings. This is actually really difficult to explain. So I tried to include an illustration of this in an appendix to my evidence. I'm particularly concerned about the cross-referencing. I think it makes it confusing, and I think that it could be relatively easily standardised and cleared up. And I've suggested some wording in Appendix 3B to address the concern that I have. Fundamentally, it's about shading, and that shading relates to a boundary. And in the circumstances where the cross-referencing occurs in the district plan, which is predominantly the community and mixed use zones, you could just have the standard applying where a boundary adjoins the zones that they're concerned about. So the residential and sensitive zones. So I did note that Mr. Friendly, in his open space written right of reply, suggested that for those zones, height in relation to boundary be extended from buildings as it is in the notified version of the district plan to include all structures. My preference is that it be retained as just applying to buildings, and as I've said before, that relates to the bulk. Having said that, I recognise that under the operative district plan, we had the ability to define buildings ourselves, and that definition related to bulk and location. Under the proposed district plan, they don't have the option to do that, and that the definition of buildings is somewhat tighter. So I've suggested that if the panel is minded to allow recommendations that would change the height in relation boundary standards to include all structures, that exclusions should be included, that recognise things like masts, flag poles, aerials, all of those sorts of things actually don't cause the effects that the height in relation boundaries are trying to control. So I've suggested that my preference is that they stay pertaining to buildings only, but if the panel decides that they should apply to structures, I think exclusions should be included. And I think that rather than having a list of exclusions, such as suggested by Mr. Friendly, perhaps you could have a look at relating it to the dimensions of the structure, because that way, having lists, it's always impossible to cover everything. So that's why I've made that suggestion. Again, I just reiterate that maybe this is, these sorts of matters could be considered as a whole as part of the sweep up hearing. So that's that particular topic.
Helen, I just wouldn't mind, I agree this topic does traverse a number of the hearings and a number of the zones. It's a plan-wide issue around terminology and quite a technical issue. Whether Denise or one of the other planners you've thought about, bringing this to the sweep up hearing and dealing with it with the whole panel, because some of us are in some hearings and some of us are on other hearings, and this is an issue that traverses a lot of the zones. So any thoughts on that, Denise, or have you talked to Sarah or anyone else about it?
We have talked, the only discussion we've had is across the 3 zones for the other rules, that those rules about separate rules for buildings. But it's something that I can talk to Miss Edwards about and get back to you, if that would be helpful.
Yes, I think just think about it, and as Helen says, just address it in your right of reply, either in terms of your zones on the merits you think it can be looked at just like that, or if you think there needs to be a wider discussion in terms of plan consistency, and perhaps bring it back to the sweep up hearing to deal with any issues across the plan, because we've finished some of the hearings already. So Kat, I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I've got to say, I thought it made a lot of sense to try and deal with this in at the end. I think it is it's an issue that goes across all of the topics, and I think the way Helen's approached it's been very helpful and patient. And I think I do think we need to address it. And but apart from someone actually being convened to actually focus on the issue across all of the chapters rather than have 4 or 5 reporting officers all sort of looking at it, I just think that's probably just going to be more problematic. But ultimately it's up to Sarah and her team. I think the best we can do is signal that it is something that needs to have someone look at across the plan and form a considered view. And, you know, I think the best time to do that's going to be in our sweep up one.
Yes, I'm presuming that we will get a section 42A sweep up report, and there'll be a list of topics that are being reserved for that. So yes, Denise and Louise, if you could definitely have a chat with Sarah, and yeah, I think just we're all reading the rights for reply as they come in, and just give some indication to both Helen as a submitter and us as a panel about whether we're going to bounce some of this forward to the sweep up hearing. That would be great. Thank you. I'm also minded that we've got our self-confessed planning geek not on this hearing, so
we'll just get him to do it all.
We yeah, I think there's different skill sets in our panel. So
yeah, I mean, I actually don't think that this, I don't want council team to read this as a criticism at all. I mean, it was inevitable when you've got multiple authors looking across multiple chapters, you do get into the detail of your own chapter. And I mean, it's inevitable that some threads that go through the whole thing sort of get missed. But that's the whole point of that last hearing session, I thought, was to find all of the things that have been pointed out along the way and join them all together and try and make them consistent.
Yeah, that's good advice. Kit, is that okay, Helen? We'll see what the staff come back with.
Yes, that's fine. I mean, I just wanted to, I felt that sometimes the point that I was trying to make wasn't being picked up. And so I think I've been reassured as to that today. And I'm happy if they have any questions for them to get hold of me.
Of course, that's always open. The hearings team knows that in terms of discussing with other submitters. You know, we're comfortable with that without standing too much on ceremony. So thanks for that. So you got another couple of points to go through, Helen?
Yep. So in terms of one of my submissions, which was rejected, was in relation, and to be fair, I made an error in my original submission in terms of the reference, and that was compounded in the summary of submissions. So Ms. Y actually wasn't sure of what I was talking about. So I've tried to clarify that in my evidence and just say, can you please put a diagram in, because it's really important. The other point that I wanted to discuss was both Ms. Young and Ms. Y have, I guess, taken my submission, which was originally in relation to maximum heights and height in relation to boundary standards, and the concerns that I had about the use of the terminology structures and buildings in there, and also recognised that those there are instances, as illustrated by Ms. Young, where there are other rules, such as setbacks, where we have that issue as well. So I guess I just wanted to point out that that wasn't something that I'd picked up on. It's not covered in my submission, and I guess it's a decision for the panel as to whether that could be considered a consequential amendment as a result of my original submission. So that's that one. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Any last questions, Kit?
No, I didn't actually. That's the rest of it all made very good. It was all very clear, and certainly some issues that I'll be interested to, I guess, get some feedback from staff on. That's all.
And Helen, certainly the extra work you've gone to sort of create some examples and do these extra tables.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
It's difficult to bring that all together, and you know, your dedication to the task is we certainly admire that. So appreciate your input.
Thank you. I think I'm also a planning geek.
Very important part of the makeup.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. All right, we're just going to, again, I haven't quite got to opening up my hearing schedule online. Christine, can you remind me?
We've got Colin Comber.
Oh, okay. Welcome, Colin.
Kia ora, good afternoon, commissioners and others.
Good afternoon.
I have with me Mr. Mike Mackay, Owakura Farm Park Limited. We can only see part of you there, Mike. Mr. Mackay is a client, and we've lodged some submissions and further submission on his behalf. I will speak to my statement of evidence first, sirs, and then Mr. Mackay will have a few words to say at the end, if that's permissible.
Can I just double check? So you've made a statement of evidence. I just haven't had it printed out from my EA, so I'll probably just take some time just to bring it up on my screen. So just to stand by.
Thank you. Do you want to just hit the screen on yourself, Colin? It's good for us to try and squeeze it on.
Here we go. Thank you. I've now tracked that down. So please proceed, Colin.
Yeah, thank you. So on page 1, I state my full name was Colin Michael Comber, residing in Plymouth, planning consultant, and I state that to avoid for the avoidance of doubt, I state that I am not a director or otherwise an officer of the applicant company, Owakura Farm Park Limited, nor do I have a shareholding or any other form of financial interest in the applicant company. Then I state my qualifications and experience, and on page 2, reference the code of conduct. And then at paragraph 10, I was engaged by Aotearoa Farm Park Limited by the director, Mike Mackay, in January 2016 as a planning consultant and project manager to prepare a private plan change request, reference PLC 1848 for the company's property at Ohakura. The Ohakura South Future Urban Zone lies wholly within the Ohakura Farm Park property, being lot 29 and some 62 hectares in area. The property has road frontages at 156 Upper Wairau Road and 1215 to 1277 South Road, Surf Highway 45, Ohakura. Since 2016, I visited the subject site and walked over it several times, variously with the registered surveyor, a landscape architect, a traffic engineer, and a civil engineer. I've also met on site on several occasions with Mana Whenua Hapu, Ngāti Tairi. So I lodged a submission in November 2019, it seems a long time ago now, on behalf of the client company, and submission point 494.3 registered or requested that the proposed rural production zone zoning with the fuzz on the property be partly rezoned from rural production to future urban zone to, in part, general residential zone and open space. The extent of the area requested to be rezoned is shown on a plan attached to the submission. It's implicit in submission 494 that the fuzz overlay on the property, which is a carry forward of the future urban development overlay of the operative plan, is supported. I've read section 42A report as set out in the document titled Future Urban Zone chapter, authored by planners Todd Whitaker and Louise Y in its entirety, and I adopt the discussion and recommendations of the report in their entirety. And if I could just interpose here, sirs, with a couple of comments. The future urban area and environs, which we now know as the Ohakura South Fuzz, formerly the Ohakura South FUD, were identified in the New Plymouth district as far back as 2006, and effectively identified Ohakura as a growth area. So the genesis for the Fuzz Ohakura South and West areas was the Ohakura Structure Plan in 2006, the Land Supply Review in 2006, the Framework for Growth of 2008, and the Plan Change 15 promulgated in 2013 for the FUD overlay. So we've got this succession of documents which culminated in the Plan Change 15, which placed the FUD overlay on the Ohakura Farm Park property and across the road in the, I think it's the Holden property, and that was FUD West. So Appendix 2 in the Section 32 report noted that the FUD areas in the operative plan were reassessed, and I quote, to understand their suitability and capacity for future growth. The Section 32 recommended no change in respect of Ohakura West and Ohakura South, and these were carried forward into the proposed district plan, and that's what we now know as the FUZ areas, Ohakura South and Ohakura West. It's important to note that the Ohakura FUZ areas are each in single ownership. So what I'm saying there is that Ohakura West is owned by one farmer entity, and Ohakura South, my client, is the sole owner of all of the area, plus some in that FUZ South area. So my comment there is this implies a development constraint if either owner does not have an appetite for development. The record showed that Ohakura Farm Park Limited does have an appetite for development having undertaken the Paddocks Rural Residential Development in 2010, and more recently the private plan change application for the Wairau Estate proposal. The Paddocks Rural Residential Development serves when you, if you venture into that part of the district, which I'm sure you will, is an Upper Wairau Road, and the Wairau Estate proposal sat behind that further to the south. Just a couple of comments about the Section 42A report titled Strategic Direction, Urban Form and Development. At para 1.5, that projects the district population in 2051 to be 104,900. Paragraph 3.1 identifies a key issue. There needs to be adequate land in the right locations for future urban growth. And 3.2 goes on to say, quote, without the inclusion of future urban zones, there is not sufficient housing development capacity in the district for the long term. So I make those points in the knowledge that some submitters are suggesting that these fuzz areas be reduced. And also note at 3.6 of the strategic direction report that between 2019 and 2021, the demand for dwellings has been reassessed to increase by 673 dwellings over the planning period, or an increase of 6.2%. So clearly growth in the district is anticipated and increasing growth. Just a couple of points on infrastructure. Ohakura has surplus capacity for infrastructure. In terms of water supply, it has the potential to serve a population of approximately 5,000. And in terms of surge capacity potential, it has a similar capacity to serve a population of up to 5,000. Present residential population, Ohakura urban area is around 1,200. So there's a lot of sunk cost in the Ohakura infrastructure that has yet to be tapped into and realised. And I also note, so there's in the infrastructure strategy document of the councils for the period 2021-2051, page 33, there's a seismic upgrade of the Ohakura number 1 reservoir proposed for 2026-27 to 1.1 million. And in the long-term plan for 2021-31, at page 42, wastewater treatment, there's a proposed upgrade of the Corbett Park pump station upgrade of 5.5 million to occur in 25-26. And for the Shera Reserve pump station upgrade, the budgeted 3.3 million for the same financial year, 2025-26. And just as background, sirs, the sewerage system at Ohakura is a network system which pumps the effluent all the way back into New Plymouth. There's no treatment at Ohakura except for simple screening, and hence the importance of these 2 pumping stations to be able to obviously operate at very reliably, and hence I guess why the council is budgeting significant expenditure for that infrastructure. I'm happy to make those notes available, sirs. Apologise that I'll send them through to Julie for you.
Yes, so you've written those additional notes up, Colin. If you could send them through, we'll just certainly have them for ourselves, get them to the staff, and certainly put them online as well, because I think we're trying to keep a very open process here of the evidence we receive. So I appreciate you writing those down and getting those through to us.
Thank you very much. So I'll just carry on then with paragraph 17 of my evidence. I note in section 6 of the report that submissions requesting changes and deletions to the spatial area and location of various fuzz areas will be considered at a rezoning hearing set down for later in the process, which is next month, we now know. So I've been advised that my submission 494 will be considered at the rezoning hearing, but I just want to note and I'm sure the staff will be able to assist you. It is noted that submission 494 is not referred to in section 6 of the section 42A report. Now that identifies the requests to request to rezone land to future urban zoning. So those are the requests that were made as rezoning requests. Now, that was the essence of my 494, and it isn't identified in the section 42A report. And those are the ones that were being carried forward to the rezoning hearing. So I just want to flag that for the staff. Then I had another submission.
There, Colin. Denise, oh, sorry, it's probably a lot of you still there, but Louise, is there anything there you need to follow up with us just on that particular point?
That is correct. The Colin's submission will be heard in the rezoning hearing.
Yes, even though, yes, so he just wanted to make sure.
Yes, it is. It's included in the rezoning hearing, even though it wasn't put in the 42A report. Okay. So it will be heard in that hearing.
Yes, okay. Thank you. Carry on, Colin.
Thank you. And then there's another orphan, sir, to report on. On the 21st of August, so this is to do with further submission 121.2. On the 21st of August 2020, I lodged with the council by email on behalf of Aokura Farm Park a further submission in opposition to approximately 40 original submissions that had requested the removal of Aokura South Fuzz from the planning maps. The intent of the further submission was to support retention of the Aokura South Fuzz on the Aokura Farm property. I can find no reference to the further submission in the section 42A report. And I'll just make a comment here. I did actually find my submission. It obviously was received by the council, but it was hidden away. So submission 121.2 consists of 2 pages only, comprising the standard pro forma filled out, together with a spreadsheet detailing the original submissions which the further submission opposes. This separate submission 121.2 is held together with and at the end of a separate 28-page further submission, which is 121.1, lodged by me on behalf of Aokura Farm Park. And that further submission was lodged in respect of original submission 522, which was lodged by Heritage New Zealand. Submission 121.1 refers to an archaeological site matter. It is possible the location of 1.1.2 has resulted in it being overlooked. So I'm sorry to burden you with this detail, but it is an orphan that we have to find a home for, sir. And I should read out for you the relief sought. It's quite clear. Confirmed the future urban zone on lot 29, which is my client's property, as publicly notified in the proposed district plan, or in the alternative, reshape the extent of the fuzz area consistent with submission 494.1. And that was a submission also on behalf of Aokura Farm Park Limited. So the relief sought was quite explicit, and that's just unfortunate. It's fallen between the cracks somewhere along the line. So in summary, the retention of the Aokura South Fuzz as originally notified in the proposed district plan is supported, as are the recommendations of the section 42A report in all respects. The further submission 121 opposes the removal of Aokura South Fuzz from the planning map, and the request within submission 494 to rezone a portion of my client's property from rural production zone and future urban zone to in part general residential zone open space is confirmed, and the proposed hearing of these matters at a rezoning hearing is noted. So that's my submission, sir, and I thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Colin, I just wanted to get a response from Louise and or Todd about 121.2, that further submission, and whether that you are aware of that, and just a response.
Todd, can you answer that?
I think what we'll need to do is make sure that the reporting planner for the rezoning hearing is aware of that orphan further submission as well. I think it will all be addressed in the assessment of the submissions in and around the zoning of the fuzz areas out at Owakura, but I'll make sure that the reporting planner is aware of that potential other orphan further submission as well.
Thank you for doing that, Todd. I think that should close the loop. Just so I'm clear, there's 40 original submissions opposing the Owakura South future urban zone. That matter will be heard at the rezoning hearing as well. That's a rezoning issue. They want to rezone it back to rural production, I presume, or yes. So that's a rezoning matter as well. That's correct.
That's correct. So that further submission will obviously be part and parcel of the assessment of those original submissions to rezone it back to rural production.
Yes. All right. So thank you for that. Kit, have you followed all that? That's
thanks. I found the further submission that we're talking about. It is right at the end of the other one as described by Mr. Coomber, so I can see that it clearly opposes 40 submissions that were opposing the fuzz on this particular property. So so that's clear. I can see that. Out of interest, Mr. Coomber, were there any further submissions opposing Owakura Farm Park's submission to have this land zoned general residential and open space? I think it is, per the concept plan in the submission.
Yes, there were.
Okay, so we can anticipate a bit of a contest around the particular zoning here, both in terms of, so I guess, whether it should remain fully rural production, whether it should be part rural production and part future urban, or whether it should be along the lines as promoted by Owakura Farm Park. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Well. Of course, I suppose the fundamental point is that the planners have recommended the FUD to be carried forward as a fuzz, and that's what's under contest. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. You mentioned in your submission that a plan change was lodged PLC in 2018. Is that right? And you said
Correct.
that at the time of lodging the submission, the request was still in process and a decision is awaited. And then you mentioned something that there's something currently before an independent hearing commission. Can you give us an update on what's the status on the plan change that you've applied?
So the private plan change was subject to a 5-day hearing, which Commissioners Wasley and Coffin presided. Mm-hmm. And in early 2020, the decision was given and the plan change was declined.
Okay. So your submission, is the plan at the back of your submission, which shows a mix of general residential, open space and some indicative roading pattern, is that essentially consistent with the layout and sort of land use proposed by the plan change?
The plan change originally proposed in a master plan approach a subdivision, if you will, or a zoning change that would have yielded something in the order of about 340 to 370 lots. And during the course of the hearing, we reduced the scale of that because we come to understand that a number of residents were felt the scale of the proposal was somewhat too large, and so the proposal attached to the submission is in fact the reduced scale proposal that we put to the
It's about 144 lots. Is that what you're referring to?
correct, yes.
Okay.
So the original plan change was sought to add improvement well beyond the site itself, including a roundabout, for example, at the Wairau Road State Highway intersection with an underpass. So it was effectively a 40-year plan. The proposal that we now have is a scaled down version of that without the add-ons, because they're no longer required, because the development won't of 144 lots won't increase the demand of traffic sufficient to warrant these other matters.
Okay. For the rezoning hearing where this will be an issue, is your client expecting to, or your client's right there, what sort of scale of evidence are you intending to call to support the submission? Will it be of a similar sort of scale to what you put up for the plan change?
That's something that we're considering. We'll wait to see what the Section 42 report recommends, and but we're aware that we will have to address a number of matters. It may not be the full scope of what we had to address at the plan change hearing, but we'll endeavour to address it in an appropriate way in response to the Section 42A report.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what more we can do at this time. I'm just conscious that how many days have we got set aside for our rezoning hearings, Mr. Daish?
I think there's 2 days, and currently I think David and I are doing those. That's my recollection.
Look, I just want to, I don't want to be the canary in the cage here, but if this particular rezoning proposal had even, you know, a reasonable amount of evidence that I'd expect for, you know, a rezoning via a district plan submission, you could potentially have 1 day of hearing just on this one. And that doesn't leave a lot for the rest of the district, a lot of time. So I guess it's maybe something we should perhaps discuss as a panel later, that if we can get a sense of the rezoning hearings that are going to be of some scale, we may have to suddenly rethink how much time we've allocated for them. That's all.
There's actually
I mean, I'll give you a case in point. The Blue Haven submission. I mean, that's nothing to do with this hearing whatsoever, but that was a relatively innocuous submission that could turn into, you know, a major production and potentially take 3 or 4 days just out of our whole schedule. And you know, this is of, I don't know, this may be easy. That this may not receive any resistance from council staff, but if it does, then just in terms of the timing for it. But look, I'm just sort of thinking out loud and probably inappropriately with everyone else in the room. I'm just conscious though of only 2 days for rezoning, and if this is just one of them.
It's 3 days, and I have been talking with the hearing administrators about timing for that. 6th, 7th, 8th of April. We've just I've just granted an extension to the 42A report writers, and also subsequently the evidence writers have got an extra week.
All right.
Just because of the scope of the matters, I think, as I understand it. But I will certainly revert or the panel needs to discuss this.
I guess, yeah, I guess we won't know what the whole thing looks like until we get much closer to the date. And I guess we'll always just have to make time if we need to resolve matters. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
That's right.
Mr. Coomer, just one last question. And I know your client is sitting there as well. What were the, I mean, what were the main reasons that the commissioners refused the plan change? Was it simply the scale, or were there a range of other reasons? Was there much opposition to it from the local community?
Yes, there was significant opposition, sir. Probably in excess of 400 submissions, I believe.
Goodness.
There's a reason for that, but we won't go into it.
No, you don't have to. I mean, 400, that's a healthy number. It's almost as much as a retirement village in Auckland. Goodness. All right, I don't need to get into that, and I won't take any more time, but thanks for explaining the background. And yeah, I might not see you on the rezoning hearing, so best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Colin and Mike, for attending and just updating us on that. It's quite a nice linking submission that we're obviously the main show will be on the rezoning hearings, but appreciate you sort of linking it into this chapter for us as well.
So sir, would you mind if Mr. Mackay said a few words?
Yeah.
Not at all.
To the commission?
Yes.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Nice to meet you. Yeah, I'm quite passionate about the project, and really enjoyed the property for a number of years. In fact, since I was 18, I've wanted to own it, and yeah, it's just something in my soul that makes it look like it's a good project. But I'm becoming aware of movements within the community to stifle progress, which is really sad because it's such a beautiful place. I did the Paddock subdivision, I've got a few notes here, but I'm just going to wing it. We had huge opposition to the Paddock subdivision, which was a 26 lot, 1 acre lot subdivision. And it's been extremely successful. Now, it was the same people in the community that objected, and I just feel that there's some barriers there, huge following with community leaders, and they have the community's ear, but I do get people that don't want to be outspoken, wanting something smaller, like a lock up and leave type property. And that's right across the board, farming clients right across down the coast. So I just see the future being successful. Now, look, we might have to wait 50 years for my dream to come real, but it will come together.
Thank you, Colin. And I think certainly the long-term prospects have ticked the boxes with the reporting planners in terms of their criteria as an area that should be looked at for future urban use. So, but as we hear, we'll hear from the other side, obviously, in the rezoning hearing, and we'll need to make a fresh determination. This does remind me that Commissioner Coffin, I have been to this area. I do know it. We've actually looked at it a couple of times, so we're very familiar with it. And of course, Commissioner Coffin won't be sitting on these hearings because of that previous decision. It's one of the ways we're managing conflicts of interests. So yes, we'll look forward to hearing from you with interest when you do appear on the substantive matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners. Thank you.
Thank you. So that brings us to the end of day 2 of hearing 17B. We'll reconvene unless there's any questions from anyone. No, we'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. starting with the New Zealand pork. We've heard all about goats, so perhaps I'll take interest in the pigs. So we'll see how we go tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.